All right, and we are good to go. So, what we're going to be doing today is this is week 15 class 2. We are going to finish up our look at adjunctive behaviors. So we're going to get to the part where we are going to take a look at adjunctive behaviors, activity, anorexia, all part of behavioral dispositions. We're going to get a cautionary tale as you go forth and maybe some of you get involved with clinical psychology to think of horses, not zebras. But before we get to that, we got to wrap up our look at objectum sexuals, and we are going to introduce some biological dispositions in behavior. We're going to take a look at preparedness and conditioning and its effect on learning, specifically for taste aversion. We are going to take a look at sign tracking. Yes, we will. We will take a look at it. There we go. We'll take a look at operant-response interactions, where we look at sign tracking, where we take a look at the idea that romantic dates always include one particular thing. We answered that thing last time. It is food. So it's always dinner and a something is your typical date. So why is that? We're going to suggest something about why that might be with operant-respondent interactions. And we're going to use those two ideas to try to figure out what's going on with people who are objectum sexuals. So last time we met Erica Eiffel, and we saw that she has a kind of unique behavior where she loves objects, but in a way that we, most people, love human beings. So her name is Eiffel because she fell in love and married the Eiffel Tower. There she is right there. And as we saw last time, this is one of the reasons why I particularly love this example, she is a very, very high-functioning individual. So there's really nothing about her that would be cause for any sort of questioning of her behavior or trying to understand her behavior. She's a champion archer. There we go. However, she's a very successful architect, very well spoken, very emotionally stable. Just conversing with her, you wouldn't think anything was atypical, but yet she has a love for objects the way that a typical individual would have a love for another human being. And I mentioned the website that that objective sexuals have. So this is a sort of meeting place, a social hub. It's called the Red Fence website. Red Fence because the founder, first love was a red fence. And this is all about, and there she is right there. This is all about individuals, again, that fall in love with objects. And they fall in love with different objects. So some of them are pictured here. And one of the things that kind of struck me was this image right here, because that is a pinball machine that used to be in the arcade that was right by my high school, and I was quite amazing at the Star Trek Next Generation pinball machine. And I will admit, I loved that game, but I was not in love with that game, right? So it's a fundamental difference. And as we're going to see, again, it's one of these things where, much like Harry was self-abusive, but the only really atypical thing about Harry was his degree of self-abuse. Right? He was just way too far. We're all somewhat self-abusive, right? If anybody has ever held their breath trying to get their parents to do something for them, we know that we have that, we might use that strategy. But Harry was just very, very extreme on that level. In the same way, we all love certain objects, right? We love maybe our cell phones, maybe we have a favorite pair of jeans, it just makes everything look great. Whatever it is, we love certain objects, but we are not in love with certain objects like Erica is. So we're going to take a look to see if we can explain her behavior using these psychological principles of these biological dispositions. So the ones that we're going to use, or the ones we're going to attempt to use, are sign tracking and preparedness. So we'll start off with preparedness. So once again, the idea that certain associations, certain stimuli are more easily conditioned than other stimuli. So that's the reason more people have a fear of spiders than they have a fear of pillowcases because we are prepared to fear spiders. We have that preparedness in us. So we're going to take a look at that. And then we're also going to take a look at sign tracking to see if it can answer why is just about every date dinner into something, or picnic into something, lunch into something. Let's meet for, even if you're just starting to date, you don't say let's meet and sit at an empty table and just talk. You say, well, let's meet for coffee. Let's meet for some form of edible substance. Why is that, and how can it help us to explain what how Erica behaves? All right, so we're going to start off with preparedness. And preparedness, this is the innate tendency. So all of these things that we're going to discuss today, these are sort of pre-programmed biological tendencies, right? So we have pre-programmed innate tendencies in ourselves to more easily learn certain types of behaviors and more easily learn certain types of associations. So we are more easily going to associate certain events with each other than other events with each other. So if we had the image of a spider paired with fear, we are much more likely to learn to fear that spider than to fear anything else that might have been around that spider, right? So if you go to the woods and you encounter a spider and you have a fearful experience there, so you have the conditioned stimulus, the neutral stimulus of a spider, you have the unconditioned stimulus of fear, maybe something scared you in the woods, then you have, and you pair that with the spider, turns it into a conditioned stimulus. Well, notice that there's a spider there, but there's also trees everywhere. There's also silk, in the spider's web. So why is it that we don't become afraid of trees? Why is it that we don't become afraid of silk? Why is it that we don't become afraid of all the other things that are there for the spider? It has to do with preparedness. It has to do with the fact that we are wired, for some reason, to learn that association with spiders more so than with anything else. And one of the big explanations for preparedness is because in our evolutionary past, certain stimuli required very rapid associations to be learned for our survival. So spiders were a problem for the cave people, right? There were poisonous spiders everywhere. And if you learned to avoid spiders after one bite, after one time that you got bit and you were sick and maybe you had a fever, maybe you were out of commission for a few days, if you learned on one trial, you were more likely to have offspring and your genetics were more likely to be successful than somebody who had to learn it 20 times over, right? So spiders were a problem. Snakes were a problem. That's one of the reasons why it's very easy for people to be conditioned to fear snakes. I'm assuming falling off cliffs was a problem because most people have a fear of heights, right? Even if you've never fallen from a high place, you probably either have or know somebody that has that fear of heights. So there are these situations that we are predisposed, innately predisposed to form these associations. So this preparedness has been very widely studied in fear conditioning. It's very important for fear conditioning, as we just touched on. But it has also been studied in taste aversion. So it's been studied in taste aversion primarily because one of the big subjects that was available for learning studies was the rat. And the rat has an amazing taste aversion mechanism because rats apparently, and I only learned this when I started teaching this course, rats apparently can't throw up. So they cannot, the way that our body protects ourselves from poison is that if we get poisoned, our stomach basically analyzes it and says no way, and then it all comes up. It saves us from ingesting that poison. Rats do not throw up. So a rat will taste anything that's new. It'll taste a very, very, very small amount. And then if it gets sick, it'll never eat that taste again. And if it doesn't get sick, it'll go back and eat it. And that's why it's very difficult to poison a rat, because it'll try a little bit, and if it gets sick, it'll avoid it for the rest of its days. So this was studied in the rat, and basically what I just mentioned was what was found. They found that if a rat tasted a little bit of something and got sick, that rat would avoid that. It would turn that neutral stimulus of here's this new food into a conditioned stimulus that was an aversive stimulus, something that the rat then actively avoided. So this taste aversion conditioning has differences. It's biologically predisposed, and it has differences from your typical classical conditioning. So the first big difference is that this form of conditioning, this form of classical conditioning, has or prefers formation of associations over long delays. So as we mentioned previously in classical conditioning, if you present your neutral stimulus and then you present your unconditioned stimulus, you ring your bell and then you present your food. Conditioning is best when the time gap between those two is very low. In fact, it's best when they're overlapped. So you ring the bell, and while the bell is ringing, you give the dog the food. That will lead the dog to salivate more quickly to just the bell being rung than if you ring the bell and then wait a few minutes and then give the dog food. That's typical classical conditioning. However, in taste aversion conditioning, because of this preparedness, the formation of associations over long delays is actually preferred. And this makes sense because if you are going to develop an aversion to the correct substance, it's not going to be something that you just ate, right? Typically when we throw up, when we have food poisoning, it's not immediate, right? It's not as soon as you eat it, you're like, oh my gosh, I feel horrible. It's an hour later where you're like, oh my gosh, I feel horrible. So it takes a while for the poison to work through your system, and then when you finally have that horrible feeling, or if you're nauseous and you end up throwing up, you associate not with the things that are there at that moment, not with anything that has high temporal contiguity, you associate with that food you ate 1 or 2 hours ago. So that is associations over long delays. That is an atypical type of conditioning that is specific to taste aversion conditioning. The next thing about taste aversion conditioning is that it is typically one trial conditioning, and again, this is why the rat is so difficult to kill with poison. So it's one trial conditioning. So unlike with Pavlov's dog, where they have to ring the bell and then they presented food, and they had to do it again, and they presented food, and they had to do it again, and then they presented food, and after a number of trials, finally they rang the bell and the dog salivated on its own. With taste aversion conditioning, it's just one trial. You try it once, you get sick, you won't eat it again. So everybody here, hopefully nobody here has ever had food poisoning. I would assume most of you probably have had some sort of an issue or an experience with food poisoning. I had food poisoning, the last time I remember having food poisoning, I tried alligator. And alligator, I tried some alligator, I threw up 2 hours later. Alligator is delicious, but I will never eat alligator again because I had one trial conditioning. And if anybody ever says, hey, here's some alligator, it's not even like a cognitive thing where I'm like, well, I had poisoning before, so I'm not going to eat it. It's more like, no, just get the alligator out of here. So it's one trial conditioning. Most of us probably, once again, know somebody, or if we don't know somebody, we might be that person who doesn't drink a particular alcohol because that alcohol, they had too much of it one night and they threw up all over the place. So it's like Tom Papa says, alcohol is the only food that comes with a story, right? So everybody has that experience. So I know one of my friends, tequila. She cannot stand the smell of tequila, and if she just gets a whiff, she's like, One time she had a bad experience with tequila. That's all it takes. One trial conditioning for this taste aversion. All right, and then the last one that we're going to see, everybody has a story. All right, so the last one here is the idea of specificity of associations. And this is also called that conditioned stimulus, unconditioned stimulus relevance. So there is a matchup between which associations are going to get strengthened when you have these different experiences. So you have the unconditioned stimulus of feeling sick, you have the unconditioned stimulus of vomiting, but then you have the conditioned stimulus that gets associated with that unconditioned stimulus, right? We had a neutral stimulus that got changed into this conditioned stimulus because of its association with this unconditioned stimulus. So let's take a look at the rat here and take a look at the rat situation. So let's say that the rat eats this food here, and it takes a little bite, and an hour later it's nauseous, and it has one trial conditioning. It has learned. Something has gone from a neutral stimulus to a conditioned stimulus in that one trial. It is going to be the food. The food is going to go from a neutral stimulus to a conditioned stimulus because of this specificity of associations. But look what else is around this rat. When the rat ate it off a white plate. But the rat is not going to be, that white plate is not going to turn into a conditioned stimulus that the rat tries to avoid. The rat will not try to avoid food on the white plate. The rat will specifically avoid this food. And look over here, we got little blue flowers. The rat is not going to develop an aversion to little blue flowers. We have silverware. The rat is not going to develop an aversion to silverware. So this specificity of associations, this conditioned stimulus, unconditioned stimulus relevance, this is the explanation for why, even though you have taste, that's one stimulus, plate, that's another stimulus, flowers, that's a third stimulus, silverware, that's a fourth stimulus, you got other stimuli all over the place. Even though there's hundreds of stimuli there, that the rat could form this one trial association because they're all there in the same amount that the food is there, the rat only forms that association to the food. So that is that specificity of association. Even though you have multiple stimuli around you, you're pre-programmed to associate that nauseousness with food and not with anything else. So that is the preparedness features, the differences between taste aversion conditioning and regular conditioning. Any questions on that before we tuck it away and come back? All right, so we are going to use something in here to help explain what Erica Eiffel, why Erica Eiffel loves objects. So remember the sexologist that was on the Tyra Bank After Dark show, where she was saying that something differently is wired in Erica Eiffel's brain. So this is how we're wired. So what I want you to start thinking about, what we're going to take a look at, is which of these features might not be working the same as our features do, and which of these features might be going into overdrive in Erica Eiffel. So which ones might she have too much of? Which ones might she have not as much as we do, or a different sort of wiring than we do out of these three characteristics? And we'll come back to that because we need one more piece to the puzzle. All right, so that next piece is going to be sign tracking. So we've got preparation and conditioning. Now we're going to do sign tracking, and we're going to start off with the textbook example, and then we're going to first try to use it to understand why dating is always dinner into something, food into something. Again, even if it's just coffee, meeting for coffee is coffee and, it's coffee. So why is it always something that's edible? We're going to take a look at that and see if we can answer what's going on there with these operant-respondent interactions. So sign tracking is this bizarre behavior that seems biologically programmed in and is a sort of extra little bit to, as we're going to see, operant conditioning. So sign tracking. Sign tracking is when an organism performs approach behaviors to a stimulus that doesn't do anything but signal the presentation of an appetitive event. So it does these approach behaviors even though it doesn't need to do the approach behaviors, even though it's never been reinforced directly for doing the approach behaviors, but just something that signals an appetitive event gets approach behaviors done to that particular stimulus. So this approach behavior is typically what occurs to the appetitive event itself. So that's one of the key things about sign tracking, is that this sign is just a signal. It's just a signal that an appetitive event is going to happen, but the signal itself starts to get those appetitive behaviors done to it without it ever being required for the contingencies. So let's take a look at this. We'll do the textbook example. They were looking at dogs. So what they did was they set up an operant conditioning paradigm here where they had a light, and that light was the discriminative stimulus for reinforcement. And when the light was on, if a lever was pressed, then food would be delivered. So when the light was off, you press the lever, nothing happens. But when that light was turned on, if the lever was pressed, then these dogs would get food, they would get a reinforcer. And not surprisingly, lever pressing increased. It increased in frequency, it increased in intensity, much like we've seen with operant conditioning. But very surprisingly, something happened to the light. The light started attracting these dogs, and these dogs started performing behaviors to the light, like licking the light, like biting the light, like chewing on the light. They were basically doing behaviors that they did with food. So there was nothing that they were rewarded for doing that. There was no reason for them to, in this contingency, to do that to the light, because the light was just a signal. It was just a sign. So that's the sign part of sign tracking. But importantly, just because of this, the behaviors that they showed to the food, they started showing to the light. They started licking it, they started biting it, they started getting their mouth all up in the light's business. So what's going on? Why did this happen? Well, this happened because of the nature of this operant conditioning paradigm. I was talking with one of you last class. In the real world, in the laboratory, you try to set up contingencies as cleanly as you can. In the real world, there's contingencies stacked on top of contingencies all the time. And as it turns out, in this situation, there's contingencies on top of contingencies. There's paradigms on top of paradigms. And you can see it if we just take out the lever press. So if you take out the lever press, right, it's still required. But notice that if we take it out, what we have is a light being presented, and then a short time afterwards, food is being delivered, right? So a lever press is required in between there, but nevertheless, the light is being presented, the dogs go, they press the lever, and then food is being presented. So in essence, we have light being presented, and that is followed by food. And that is done over and over and over again. And what we have here is we have classical conditioning hidden inside of operant conditioning. So the light, which is a discriminative stimulus for reinforcement, is also a neutral stimulus, right? It starts off as a neutral stimulus. And the food, which is your reinforcer, that's an unconditioned stimulus. We've seen that before. So what you really have here is you have a light, neutral stimulus being paired with food. Food causes food behaviors. It causes things like eating, like licking, like biting. So the food, the unconditioned stimulus, causes food behaviors. So this is also going on hidden inside of that operant conditioning, paradigm. And after repeated presentations of the light followed by the food, the light becomes a conditioned stimulus. And then the light on its own, by itself, can now cause a conditioned response. And the conditioned response is food behaviors. So this is why the light on its own starts to elicit those food behaviors. That lever press is in there, but again, we have this classical conditioning paradigm kind of hidden within this operant conditioning paradigm that causes that light to eventually turn from a neutral stimulus to a conditioned stimulus that causes the conditioned response of these food-like behaviors. All right. Any questions about that typical textbook example? All right. So let's take a look at date night. Why is date night going to be dinner into something? Right? What is the sort of strategy behind it? Why is that something that in our culture is done over and over and over again? Well, one of the reasons it's done over and over and over again is because it's a successful strategy, right? It's just something that leads to stronger. Every time I do this, I always laugh because I sound like an android that has just discovered human love. It's like going out on a date leads to stronger pair bonding and emotional increases, and it leads to stronger pair bonding. Let's just go with that. So we're going to discuss why this is by taking a look at sign tracking. And this one, I've kind of already jumped the gun. This is going to be a little PG. So we'll try to keep it as PG as possible. But, you know, it does contain adult themes. All right, so let's get scientific on this. So, what is a date? We've already taken a look at as a date as a classical conditioning paradigm. A paradigm where you are the neutral stimulus. You want to pair yourself with fun, which is the unconditioned stimulus. That unconditioned stimulus leads to the unconditioned response of happiness, right? Fun leads to happiness. And you're hoping that eventually you change from a neutral stimulus to a conditioned stimulus that by itself causes happiness, right? And that's why people try to plan fun dates. But what else is happening on a date? Remember I said it's not always as clean in the real world. Well, in a date as well, you have an operant conditioning paradigm. So in this operant conditioning paradigm, you have the person that, let's say person A, they're the person that asked the other individual out on a date. Person A asked the other individual out on a date. And when person A is there, if this other person does dating behaviors, right? If they engage in good conversation, if they are fun to be with, if they are warm and welcoming, if they are responsive, right? If they have the right date behaviors, then they get rewarded with food, right? So if the conversation is going great, if everything is going great, that good date behavior leads to food as a reinforcer. And if you don't believe this, try doing horrible date behaviors, like throwing a drink in your date's face, and see if they say things like, well, let's still have dinner. Why not, right? No, this is the contingency that's in place. So again, person A, that's the signal. When person A is there, when the person that asked you out on the date is there, and you do dating behaviors, you will then be rewarded with food. That's the operant conditioning aspect of this. Notice that part of it is food, right? This is the dinner and that's part of every single date. Because other things are fun, right? Movies are fun, parks are fun, fairs are fun, the beach is fun. So why always food as well, right? That's not needed for classical conditioning, but what it is needed for is sign tracking. So we have this person A, discriminative stimulus for reinforcement. Dating behavior is the behavior that they're reinforcing. Food is the reinforcer to increase that dating behavior. But also note, take out the dating behavior and what do you have? You have person A and you got food. So person A is your neutral stimulus, right? First date, person A is a neutral stimulus. Food is an unconditioned stimulus. Food leads to food-like behaviors, right? So food leads to things like licking, and food leads to things like, importantly for this situation, taking something and getting it close to your mouth, right? That's how you eat. That's what you do with food. You take the food, you bring it close to your mouth. You take the coffee, you bring it close to your mouth. You take that edible substance, you bring it close to your mouth. So food leads to these food behaviors of bringing things close to your mouth. After a few dates, that person A goes from a neutral stimulus to a conditioned stimulus. And now that conditioned stimulus will by itself cause those food-related behaviors, the conditioned response of food-related behaviors. And the important thing here is the food-related behavior of bringing something to your mouth, aka what we in our society, I have heard, call a kiss, right? So if you have ever been out with somebody and you're out on the first date and you go to dinner and a movie and at the end of the date you're kind of like, you know what, I kind of like them, but not going to kiss them yet. Fine. You go to the second date, it's dinner and something else. You get to the end of the date, you're like, not ready, not going to kiss them, not quite yet. You go on a third date, dinner and something else. At the end of that date, all of a sudden you're like, you know what? Now's the time. Now I feel it. Now this stimulus has changed from a neutral stimulus to a conditioned stimulus. And for some reason, I want to bring them to my mouth, right? That's what a kiss is. You say, look, you physically come here, right? You physically come over here. And that is that food-related behaviors. And notice, that wouldn't happen by going to the beach. That wouldn't happen just by going to the movies. That wouldn't happen just by going to the fair. There's nothing else that we regularly do where we bring things close to our mouth. And kissing is such an important aspect of the romantic behavior that we have in our society that it is no wonder that food is part of everything, because if you've ever gone through that experience where you looked at somebody and said, not quite ready for the kiss, and you transitioned to, come over here, let's do this, that is sign tracking, because that person became a conditioned stimulus that caused the conditioned response of food, because food was continually presented in their presence. All right, so any questions about sign tracking and the explanation of dinner into something? Does it make sense? Is everybody going to be suspicious now when they go out on a date? They're like, let's have some dinner. All right. So we got sign tracking right now. So an organism performs approach behaviors, and then they get those approach behaviors that are typically for that appetitive event. Okay, so that's our final piece, this sign tracking, these approach behaviors that are typically occur to that particular appetitive event. So now we got these 4 pieces of information. We are going to try to apply them to understand Erica Eiffel, and we are going to see what might be working overtime, what might not be working overtime, what might be working very typically, and what might not be working very typically. So, any ideas about what is going on in or for Erica Eiffel? Well, let me set up the situation first off. If you ever go to Paris, one of the things about Paris is it's got the Eiffel Tower. One thing that you'll notice, if you're ever in a city that has a tower, and I know this, I come from Toronto originally, we got the CN Tower. If you ever go to a city with a tower, one thing that you notice is that the tower is almost always visible when you're in the city. So it almost doesn't matter where in Toronto you are, there's the tower. And from a lot of places in Paris, doesn't matter, you know, you're at a restaurant, you're out on the River Seine or whatever, you're out on at the Louvre, you look, there's the tower. So the tower is there oftentimes while she was in Paris, right? So she's out in Paris having fun with her friends, the tower is there. So the first thing that we'll mention, or the first thing that I'll mention is, in terms of this operant-respondent interactions, these approach behaviors that typically occur to an appetitive event, I cannot imagine that anybody goes to Paris and doesn't go to a restaurant, right? I can't imagine that they just wouldn't go out and taste the food. It's like one of the countries that is known, you know, for their cuisine. So we can imagine that she ate a lot of food in Paris. She went out to a lot of restaurants. She had that sign tracking behavior going. She went out to dinner and a something when she was in Paris. Remember, she was out there with friends. They would definitely have gone out to a bunch of different areas. So when she was finally kissing that the CN Tower, I don't know, maybe she likes the CN Tower too. But when she was finally kissing that Eiffel Tower, it could have been because of this sign tracking behavior, that she was having food while she was in Paris. She saw the tower went from being a neutral stimulus to a conditioned stimulus that elicited that conditioned response that she had with food. So she would approach the tower, she would want to kiss the tower. That was part of what was going on. In terms of formation of associations over long delays, that we don't know. That there's not enough in her story to tell us about. But what about the last 2 over here? Right? So we know that sign tracking is working with her. We know that she definitely has, or seems to have, that ability to form that neutral stimulus, the conditioned stimulus that causes that approach behavior. But what about, for example, one trial condition? So does anybody remember the story that she said about how she fell in love with the Eiffel Tower? Somebody want to recap?
She went to the tower to get a photograph, but then all the lights went out, and all of a sudden it just lit up.
Okay, so she goes to the tower one day to take a photograph of the tower, you know, and then, you know, this just, I think it was like a cloudy day or something, it just wasn't a great photograph. And then she was all, you know, sad, and then the tower just lit up in this huge display, and that was when the tower proposed to it. That was when the tower did that one romantic gesture. Is that an indication of strong one-trial conditioning Or is her love for the tower not one trial condition? Based on that example. Well, I heard murmurs of one. It would be one trial conditioning, right? It is one trial conditioning. So notice that when she mentioned, it's like, oh, well, how did you, propose to the tower? How did you fall in love with the tower? When she talks about the tower, she talks about that one event, right? She talks about that one time she went, that one time that the tower lit up, and she goes straight from, that's when the tower proposed, right? When the tower absolutely lit up. Notice what's missing is any sort of build-up to that. Notice that she doesn't say anything like, well, when we first landed in Paris, as I got out of the plane, I kind of saw the tower, and I kind of saw, the tower was looking at me, and I kind of saw the tower, but then I didn't think anything of it. And then later, on in the day when we were at the restaurant, I saw the tower was there, and it just seemed that it understood me, and there was something about the tower, but not yet. And then the next day, I had this experience with the tower, and then the next day, I had this experience with the tower, and I started to develop this connection to the tower, and then all of a sudden, this big, huge light display. That would be multi-trial conditioning, right? That would be multiple dates with this tower. Notice she never mentions anything like that. So it could be that her one trial conditioning is actually wired very strongly for romantic involvement. It could be, right? The bridge would be another, would be a counterexample, because she said, oh, I saw this bridge for years, and I just drew strength from it. But at the very least, that Eiffel Tower experience was a one trial conditioning. It was basically almost love at first sight. When that one big experience occurred, she fell in love with the Eiffel Tower. So that preparedness, that one trial conditioning, that is very, very strong. We got one piece left. What about specificity of associations? Is this working typically in Erica? Is this working not typically in Erica? What do people think? Yep.
How you mentioned that she probably saw it everywhere she was. So if she was out having fun and there was a different conditioned stimulus causing the conditioned response of happiness, maybe she associated just the tower instead of the other stimulus that was actually causing that, or that was initially causing happiness.
Yeah, exactly. So that's good. That's exactly what I think her cross wirings would be. She has everything basically working the same way that it works in us. She's got that one trial conditioning, maybe a little bit stronger than us, but definitely what is different is that specificity of associations. So Paris is known as the city of love because people go to Paris and they have these wonderful experiences. They have great food, there's great architecture, there's art, there's river cruises, there's all these wonderful romantic experiences that you can have. And for a typically wired individual, when they're having those romantic experiences, they start forming associations with the people that they're with, right? They start forming associations with the friends that they came with, and those associations might turn romantic. So you have a bunch of these experiences with somewhat neutral stimuli, right? They're your friends, but they're not romantic partners. But you have experiences with somewhat neutral stimuli, and those experiences paired with those neutral stimuli change them into conditioned stimuli that then cause the conditioned response of love. Now, again, in typical individuals, let's say that you're dating somebody and you have a favorite restaurant. So you go to that restaurant all the time, and they have a very distinct checkered tablecloth. And you go to that restaurant, you have a wonderful time, the associations start to grow. You go to that restaurant again, you have a wonderful time, associations start to grow. You go to it again, you have a wonderful time, associations start to grow. That person will not at one point look you in the eye and say, you know what, I just got to tell you that I love this tablecloth. I have formed a deep bond to this tablecloth. Every single time I come here, I have a wonderful time. Oh, tablecloth, my tablecloth, right? They're not going to do that because they have specificity of associations. Even though that tablecloth has been there the whole time, they don't fall in love with the tablecloth, they fall in love with the human. Specificity of associations. Whatever wires us to associate that good time with fellow humans, that wiring is different in Erica Eiffel. And she associates those good times with other objects. So she, the whole time that she was in Paris and she had a wonderful time, everybody else saw the Eiffel Tower. It's not like she was the only one that noticed it. But while they all started making associations between, oh, I'm having a wonderful time, oh, and my friends are with me, she was forming these associations with, oh, I'm having a wonderful time, look, it's the Eiffel Tower. Oh, this restaurant is amazing, look, it's the Eiffel Tower. Oh, what a romantic riverside walk. Oh, look, it's the Eiffel Tower. And she formed associations to the Eiffel Tower, fell in love with the Eiffel Tower instead of any of the friends that she was with. So this, I would say, is the key difference. This seems to be working well. I mean, the fact that she interacts with her objects, again, is very typical. I mean, that's the approach behaviors that you would make to appetitive stimuli. Remember, appetitive stimuli is all about approach. And remember that she interacts with her objects by touch. She likes to hold them, be close to them. But this is definitely the thing that is rewired. So it's not unheard of, or it's not, how can I best say this? It's not a sort of aberration in the sense that we also have this wiring. It's just different because we're wired to form associations with other humans. She's wired to form associations with other objects. All right, so any questions about this final analysis of Erika Eiffel? We're all good? All right. So what we're going to do now is we're going to start up on part 2. We'll see how far we get on this, our final biological dispositions for learning. But we're going to start off with, again, a cautionary tale. For those of you that are thinking of going into clinical psychology, this is a great thing to remember. Think of horses, not zebras. And then we're going to take a look at a couple of bizarre behaviors known as adjunctive behaviors, schedule-induced polydipsia. And we're also going to take a look at activity anorexia and see its parallels with human anorexia. So once again, an animal model teaching us stuff about human behavior. But before we do that, let's get to the think of horses, not zebras. So the Erika Eiffel case, once again, seems to be linked to these very basic learning principles and this very basic rewiring. So it is very likely that people who are objective sexuals, people that fall in love with objects, they don't have any sort of atypical, or nothing else is atypical about them except that specificity of associations. There's something about how they're wired so that the specificity of associations isn't linking romantic times with humans, it's linking romantic times with the objects that are around. And that knowledge of specificity of associations is part of the reason why we go here to get an education, because again, the example on the Tyra Banks After Dark show, and again, Tyra Banks, highly intelligent individual, not a psychologist. And clearly not a psychologist, because when she heard Erika's story, her mind immediately went to your typical kind of reaction in our society, where it doesn't have anything to do with trauma, with abuse, with sexual abuse, with rape, with anything like that. So she was thinking that, oh, the only thing that makes sense to my mind would be that Erika Eiffel had this horrible experience with humans. And because of that, she has now fallen in love with objects. Because humans hurt her at one point, she now fell in love with objects. That's where her mind sort of goes. And that's where a lot of our minds go when we see anybody that has a sort of unusual behavior, right? That was the explanation for homosexuals for a long time, that they must have had some traumatic experience, heterosexual experience, and that's why they've changed to the other, other orientation. That was what these sort of intuitive explanations are. And I love that the sexologist basically was like, no, it has nothing to do with that. If it did, there would be way more objective sexuals. It has to do with the rewiring of their brain. So that's part of the reason why we're here, to learn about those actual principles that might account for these things, and not that intuitive kind of narrative that society teaches us. But another narrative that society teaches us, or maybe not society, but something that we almost, I guess, naturally go for is this exotic behavior, these exotic explanations, these out there explanations. And you've seen these come up, and they seem to be more of an issue today than they were before. And I love this quote from Alan Moore. If you're enjoying the new HBO Watchmen series, it's based on his work. Incidentally, he does not approve, but anyways, this is a great quote from him. And he goes, the main thing that I've learned about conspiracy theories, and they are just coming out of the woodwork now, is that conspiracy theorists actually believe in a conspiracy because that is more comforting. The truth is the world is that it is chaotic. The truth is that it is not the Jewish banking conspiracy or the gray aliens or the 12-foot reptiloids from another dimension that are in control. The truth is more frightening. Nobody's in control. The world is rudderless. But we like to think that we are in control. We like to think that we do understand things. And people with conspiracy theories about a flat earth, conspiracy theories about the reptiloids, I mean, that's an actual thing. Go online, but set a time limit. Don't fall down the rabbit hole. Get offline after about 5 minutes, because I don't want anybody swallowing a red pill. But go online and just search for some of these conspiracy theories, and you'll see there's actual video evidence that people believe show reptiloid eyes, blinking in politicians and things like that. They like to take evidence that could be explained in very normal ways and go for these very exotic explanations. People like that. It just makes more sense. It feels, for some reason, safer. And you'll see this in a very famous quote about zebras and horses. And this is from Dr. Theodore Woodward. And he was a very successful doctor in the States. I think he was one of the first presidents of the Medical Association, or whatever their big association is. And he would tell his students, he goes, when you hear hoofbeats, think of horses, don't think of zebras, not zebras. So this is one of those things where, they would, this happened all the time when they were learning how to diagnose diseases. And they would take a look at the diseases, and they would come up with these exotic diagnoses, right? They would come up with basically the plot for any episode of House. And he kept trying to tell them, look, this is not, some exotic virus from some small nation in South America. This is the cold. It's the cold. Like, just if you see symptoms for a cold, assume that it's the cold. So that's just my little warning as we go forward. Remember the things we've learned today. Because again, it's just, I don't know what it is. Probably other people that have done personality psychology would know. But there's something inside of us that just naturally wants to take a look at Erica and say, you know what, there has to have been some trauma. There has to have been some sort of, sexual abuse. Because that is more interesting than saying, well, no, it's actually a conditioned stimulus, unconditioned stimulus relevant situation where her wiring is a little different. So don't forget the lessons we've learned, right? Don't forget the straightforward explanations. When the straightforward explanations are the right explanations, make sure that you point to them and say, hey, look, horses, rather than keep going, where are those zebras? Where did they go? All right, so adjunctive behaviors. This is another one of those instances where intuitively our mind would go to a very exotic explanation. We're going to see that it's actually just a result of a contingency, an intermittent reinforcement contingency. So adjunctive behaviors. Adjunctive behaviors are these excessive behaviors, way beyond the regular amounts, that emerge as a byproduct. They're a side effect of intermittent schedules of reinforcement for some other behavior. So you reinforce some behavior like bar pressing, and all of a sudden, this excessive pattern of another behavior, such as drinking water, comes across just as a byproduct of the fact that you are intermittently reinforcing bar pressing. And that water example is one of the most studied adjunctive behaviors, and that's why we have this schedule-induced polydipsia for basically drinking too much water. So schedule-induced polydipsia, this is when you are, again, on an intermittent schedule, and this is either a fixed interval or fixed time schedule of reinforcement. So remember, the fixed interval schedules is where you have to wait and it's only the first response after an interval is over that will get reinforced. So you have nothing to do or don't need to do anything during that entire interval. It's just that first response after the interval expires that is going to get reinforced. So if you are reinforcing a rat for bar pressing, and you put that rat on a fixed interval or fixed time schedule of reinforcement, so you bar press and the bar press delivers food, not surprisingly, bar presses will increase. So not surprisingly, you're going to get more and more bar pressing. But rather surprisingly, those rats will start drinking a ton of water, like a lot of water, like an unhealthy amount of water. I say as I drink some water. Anyways, they will excessively drink that water. So that is the polydipsia. Polydipsia, the excessive drinking of water, schedule-induced polydipsia, because it came from them just being on this fixed interval scheduled reinforcement, not for drinking though, very importantly, for bar pressing. So what I'm going to say here, first off, most of us should probably drink more water. That's just my public service announcement. So if you feel you don't drink enough water, maybe put yourself on a fixed interval scheduled reinforcement or something else. But this is a kind of this is a possible explanation for people that have excessive amounts of behavior that cannot be explained by traditional means. And those problem excessive amounts of behavior might be something like alcohol abuse, right? You're just drinking way too much alcohol. It might be something like drug abuse, right? You're just doing way too much alcohol, way too much drugs. And this is, again, the hoofbeats, not zebras type explanation, because as a psychologist, it's your job to help these particular individuals, and information like this is something that is the reason why we do this training, is the reason why you sit in this room. Because let's just say that you have a client, and your client comes in, and they say, you know what, I got a problem. I'm an alcoholic, or I have a problem, I'm a drug addict, I just can't stop, doing these behaviors. And you say, all right, you know what, I can treat you, but we have to find the cause, of your addiction. We have to find the cause of why you are drinking excessively. So you start running through the list of the typical, the typical explanation. So you ask them, is there a history of alcoholism in your family? And they might look at you and say, no history of alcoholism. Nobody in my family has ever been an alcoholic. So you're like, okay, suspect number one, check them off the list. You might say, are you under any particular stress, in your life? Like, do you have a horrible job? And they might say, no, job's awesome. It's actually a dream job. I find it very fulfilling. I'm glad to go to work every single day. It's a very rewarding experience. Job's great. You're like, okay, check. Job's great. And you might say, have you had a recent loss? Has there been a recent, traumatic event? And they might say, no. In fact, this has been one of my best years ever. Everything is going great. Everything is perfect. And you're like, okay, fine, check. So you might go through the entire checklist and not hit any of those typical, well-known causes of alcoholism. At this point, as a psychologist, you don't want to say to that person, well, I've gone through the checklist and you shouldn't be an alcoholic, so thank you for stopping by. Good luck with the rest of your life. I can't help you. We don't get to do that, right? As psychologists, we're here to help this individual. So you would keep digging and you would keep digging. And in the conversation with the person, they might say to you, oh yeah, well, one of the things that happened earlier this year is my husband, who's in the military, he was deployed, right? So he got deployed to another country, and every Friday we get to Skype. So they don't get to Skype, FaceTime every single day, but every Friday, 7 p.m. comes around, they get 1 hour of Skype time, right? Let's say that that's the indicator, that's the situation. At that point, as a psychologist, as a trained psychologist, somebody who's been in this room, you would say to that person, oh, okay, that might be schedule-induced polydipsia. Because you take a look at their life and you say, okay, so you are being rewarded. You're on a reinforcement schedule where you can talk to your husband. That's the reinforcement, getting to Skype with your husband. Yes, it is. The behavior is turning on Skype and signing in. That gets reinforced with an hour of speaking with her husband. Yes, it is. When does that get reinforced? It gets reinforced when an interval expires. You don't get reinforced for signing in on Thursday. You don't get reinforced for signing in on Wednesday. You gotta wait till Friday at 7, and then you get reinforced. That person is on a fixed interval scheduled reinforcement. That Skyping that leads to talk with the husband is being reinforced, but because of that, and I don't know what the mechanism is, but because of that, that could be a cause of their excessive drinking. So if that is actually the case, what you would tell this individual is that you need to get off that fixed interval. You cannot remain on this fixed interval. That is what is causing your alcoholism. And again, it's not a sexy explanation, it's not an exotic explanation, it's not trauma, it's not genetics, it's not anything like that. It's a very little known schedule-induced polydipsia, but again, that's why we're here, because you will come across these cases where all the typical answers, all of the typical things just do not cause it, and as a psychologist, you need to know to be able to help this person that it might, in this case, be schedule-induced polydipsia. Any questions about that? All right, and just importantly as well, this schedule-induced polydipsia was the one that was most often seen was the excessive drinking of water. But this could be an underlying effect of any excessive behavior that was never reinforced. So if you take a look at people with obsessive compulsive disorder, right? People that excessively wash their hands, they're not reinforced for washing their hands 50 times a day. In fact, it gets painful to wash your hands that many times a day. Children with OCD that might, for this case, line up their gummy bears in different colors before they can eat them. Right? They have those excessive types of behavior. I know that again, if I eat something like M&Ms or if I eat something like gummy bears, I'll grab a few of the same flavor and toss them in. That's just, you want an extra little, you don't want to mix the flavors, right? But I don't do this. That's excessive. That's too much of that behavior. And again, you might run through these particular individuals and you might go right down that checklist. Was there any sort of trauma? No, there wasn't. History of OCD? No, there isn't. Were you reinforced for being incredibly neat? No, I wasn't. Are you anxious about anything in your life? No, I'm not. Is this a result of a hidden desire that you want your parents to die? No, it's not. You just keep going through all of it. I think that's one of the, at least psychoanalysis explanations of OCD. Anyway, you go through all the checklists, and there's nothing there. At that point, you might say, you know what? Tell me about how you get reinforced. Tell me about things that you do. And they might, again, say something like, oh, well, every single Saturday, I get to do this. I get to do this particular, every single Saturday, my mom visits and we get to have a wonderful day. And I have to wait until Saturday. You might say, oh my gosh, there it is, fixed interval schedule of reinforcement. Wait until Saturday to go out, have a good time with your mom, leads to those excessive other behaviors. All right, so any questions about that? It's all good? Okay, so we are going to wrap up today with, once again, just another kind of cautionary tale. And I mentioned some of these because, as we're going to see, a lot of times in our popular society, in our mainstream culture, you're going to find that psychology and psychologists are kind of underappreciated. Right? So I think I've mentioned this before. Most people consider themselves amateur psychologists. Right? If you go to somebody and you meet somebody new at a dinner party and they're like, oh, what do you do? And you're like, oh, I'm a psychologist. Most of the time you might get a response like, oh, well, I'm actually a bit of a psychologist myself. Right? And what they mean is that, oh, they feel intuitive, they feel like, they have a handle on the human experience. Psychology is a science, right? Just like any other science. So nobody ever says, oh, what do you do? Oh, I'm a theoretical physicist. Well, I'm a little bit of a theoretical physicist myself. I use gravity. Oh, right, all the time, right? Nobody says that. So one of the things that you're going to encounter is the idea that psychology is somehow just intuition, somehow just common sense. And part of the reason for that is, I think, because of the way that mental disorders or mental illnesses are presented in our society in terms of stories. If you ever watched a movie where somebody has a mental illness, it is usually very clear what caused that mental illness. And one of my favorite examples comes from Tangled. So we're going to take a look at the best song in Tangled, and this is what we'll wrap up with today. So this is, if you don't know, that's Mother Gothel. She kidnapped Rapunzel as a child, and Rapunzel's magic hair has been keeping her young all these years. But she keeps Rapunzel isolated and locked up in a tower, which seems to be a theme for Disney these days. But anyways, here we go. All right, so up until now, right, just presenting the world as a terrifying place, just exacerbating all her fears, and basically portraying a world that is incredibly dangerous. And if that wasn't enough for an isolated individual that has lacked human contact her entire life, how about a little gaslighting? All right. So that was a song, and if oftentimes you'll see these psychology articles in clinical psychology that will diagnose a fictional character, right? And if Rapunzel actually existed and you were her clinical psychologist, she came in one day and she was like, you know, I'm kind of feeling depressed, I'm kind of feeling really anxious, you know, I have all this social anxiety, you know, I need some help, you know, to deal with these issues. If she was in your office, it would take you like 2 minutes to know exactly what was going on. So you would say, well, tell me about your life. And she would say, well, I grew up isolated in a tower. And you'd be like, oh my gosh. And she'd be like, yes, and my mother kept telling me about how bad things were, and she called me chubby, and she said I had no strategies or skills or was naive. You know, it would take you no time. And I think that's one of the issues that people have with psychology, is that it seems obvious, right? If they had issues, it seems obvious. And we're going to see again that sometimes it's not so obvious. So when we get to anorexia nervosa and activity anorexia, again, people have those kind of obvious, intuitive explanations for why is anorexia, you know, occurring in an individual. But as we're going to see, sometimes for some individuals, it's not that straightforward. And we'll end with just this observation. So I mentioned the fact that, you know, it's not if Rapunzel ever needs psychiatric therapy, it's when Rapunzel needs psychiatric therapy. And I love the fact that people picked up on this in Wreck-It Ralph 2, because if you take a look at the reaction that the princesses have when Penelope comes into their room, that breaking your slipper and threatening a child is not the appropriate response to finding a child in your room, right? Trying to murder a little girl, I think, is a sign that, you know, you have issues that need to be dealt with. And basically and just in case she doesn't finish her off, Jasmine is ready there. But again, this is that kind of thing where people recognize, oh yeah, these princesses will probably have issues. But, you know, again, you talk to Cinderella for 2 minutes, you're going to know where these issues come from. That's fantasy. In the real world, we're going to see it's a little bit more complex. And next time, we're going to take a look at activity anorexia and what it can tell us about actual anorexia. Other than that, if there's no questions, all right, we are done for today.